This is Duke University.
I'm going to emphasize their stability relative to other types of capital flows, as well as their countercyclicality, the rather peculiar characteristic of the capital flow that they tend to increase when times get bad back in the home country, as migrants send more money back home to cushion their families. I'm then going to confront the conventional wisdom about the politics of exchange rate regime choice in the developing world with the rise of remittances. And I'm going to argue that inflows of remittances serve as a substitute for domestic monetary policy adjustment, and therefore make countries more likely to adopt fixed exchange rates. I'm going to take that hypothesis to the data, and it's a newly available data set on remittances from the World Bank, combined with a relatively new data set on de facto exchange rate regimes. And finally, I'm going to discuss conclusions and implications. So, which countries receive remittances? Well, contrary to what you expect, it's not simply the poorest of countries. About half of total remittances go to the so-called lower middle income bracket, which are countries defined by the World Bank with GDP per capita of approximately $1,000 to $3,500 per year. The recipients of remittances are geographically diverse, with about half going to East Asia and Latin America, and the other half split between South Asia, Europe and Central Asia, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's more helpful for my ultimate purposes to look at remittances scaled to GDP. So here are the top 15 or so countries in terms of inflows of remittances scaled to GDP for the year 2004. And there are some very poor countries on this list. We see Moldova and Lesotho, for example, on the list. But we also see some wealthier developing countries. We see Jordan, for example, with more than 20% of its GDP accounted for by remittances. We see Honduras and El Salvador and the Philippines, Lebanon, countries that are not necessarily at the poorest tier in terms of World Bank rankings. I should note also that if we were to look at gross flows of remittances rather than scale to GDP, the top countries would include, as you would expect, China and India, Mexico, as well as a few developed countries. Spain and France would be on the top list as well. Okay, just very quickly before I move along here. Which countries send remittances? The United States is the largest source country. The next largest source country, we believe, is Saudi Arabia. And other large source countries include the Western European countries, Germany, France, Switzerland, and Italy, as well as a few other Middle Eastern countries. And I would expect that the United Arab Emirates would find itself on this list pretty soon, just given the number of Indian migrant workers who are building those 6-star hotels in Dubai these days, and sending a lot of money back home. Is that remittances are far less volatile than other forms of capital, including foreign aid. So it seems that family members are far less fickle when it comes to sending money back home to their parents than the governments of wealthy countries, whose foreign aid budgets seem to ebb and flow with the political times. So more about this countercyclicality, because it's pretty important for my argument. Okay, so this leads to a core hypothesis, which I'm going to test. And that is, all else equal, remittance inflows increase the probability of fixing the exchange rate in the developing world. All right, before I test this hypothesis, let's take a quick look at the data. At least take a look at some examples. So here are some examples of what I'm calling high remittance fixers. These are countries that fix their exchange rates to varying degrees, and in parentheses is the percentage of remittances as a share of the economy. So in terms of hard pegs or dollarizers, we have Jordan and El Salvador, Lebanon, Ecuador, all countries with remittances that exceed 5% of their GDP, and in some cases exceed 15 or even 20% of their GDP. And countries that are still fixed but allow a little bit of flexibility: Honduras, Jamaica, Sri Lanka, Guatemala, also with very high remittances as a share of GDP. It says that clearly there's a multi-causal story about exchange rate regimes here. Remittances certainly can't explain all of the variation, and I wouldn't expect it to. So let's move to a multi-causal story. So my empirical test, the dependent variable is the de facto exchange rate regime. This is an index which ranges from 1 to 4, where 1 indicates a fixed exchange rate, 4 indicates floating, and 2 and 3 are intermediate regimes between those two. And this is a measure of the actual exchange rate regime. Now that might sound pretty basic to those of you who haven't studied exchange rate politics, but it turns out that in most of the literature in political science and economics over the past 15 years, the measure that people have been using is the so-called de jure exchange rate regime. That is what governments say they're doing, their proclaimed or official policy, whether they're fixing their exchange rate or floating. And it turns out that there's often a big discrepancy between what countries say they're doing and what they're actually doing. Sometimes countries say that they're floating the exchange rate, that they don't intervene and they allow the exchange rate to be determined by market forces. But in fact, they're doing just that, either with intervention directly in foreign exchange markets or through interest rate adjustments or some other mechanism. So in my case, I'm not so interested in what governments say they're doing. I'm looking at what they're actually doing, what their actual regime is. And Reinhardt and Rogoff have put together this wonderful data set that does just that, calculates what the actual regime is based on looking at exchange rate. What does it look like? Well, so here's the predicted probability of fixing the exchange rate by levels of remittances, with all other variables held at their means. So it's a simulation that I ran. There aren't too many countries, as you might expect, with remittances as a share of GDP in excess of, say, 20 or 25%. So as we move to the right along the x-axis, my confidence intervals, which are the dotted lines, start to widen quite a bit. But we can see that, for example, when you hold all other variables at their means, when you increase remittances from 5% of GDP to 15% of GDP, that the probability of fixing goes from 20% to 30%, or approximately a 10% increase in the probability of fixing with that change. Or going from 5% GDP for remittances to 20% GDP, that value goes from 20% to about 35%. So my entree into this development, my sort of handle, was through the politics of exchange rate regime choice, where scholars in the past have taken capital flows for granted, really, as exacerbating this trade-off, exacerbating the severity of the trade-off between stability and flexibility. And I'm trying to show here that remittances tend to lessen the severity of that trade-off. And the data, as problematic as they are, and potentially as problematic as the analysis might be, seem to support that assertion. So, final note, what exactly am I doing here in a larger picture? This is part of a larger effort to unpack financial globalization into its component parts. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that not all capital is the same, and capital flows don't all have the same impact on national policy choices.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.